Welcome to Play the Man Podcast, a podcast seeking to build sturdy men in a wobbly world.
Welcome back to the Play the Man Podcast. I'm Zach Fink, the host, and we have Pastor Shane Pennington, Pastor Peter Johnson, and a guest today, Mr. Joe Hall, who's going to talk to us about ministry across the world. Joe, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So to start us off, could you tell us a little bit about the work that you do, why you do it, and what it looks like? And then we have some questions, I think. So
yeah, for sure. So I work for a ministry called International Christian Response. We have been in operation for more than 60 years, based out of Switzerland initially, started by the very well-known Richard Wurmbrand. And then we've been in the U.S. since 2008. And so we currently work in about 55 countries where we consider persecution to be the worst, if you can say that. That's kind of our priority for where we choose to work. We've got more than 300 projects that are going in those 55 countries. And so we exist to kind of be a bridge between churches here in North America and the U.S. and our body of Christ around the world that's suffering and who just faces great opposition because they are Christian, because they bear the name of Christ. And so in the field, in those 55 countries, we try and find ways, we call it support, equip, advance. We try and find projects, partners, churches on the ground in those locations. And we try and use funds to support persecuted believers. That looks like a lot of different things. Sometimes it's imprisonment. Sometimes it's medical bills. Sometimes it's people have lost their homes. They've lost their jobs. They have no access to food. So using funds to help the church in those situations. The second category we call it equip. So we want to do projects that are going to equip local churches in these areas. Sometimes they don't have access to Bibles or good resources or good training materials for their own congregations. And so, we want to do whatever we can to help the church stand and grow. And obviously, they need to endure in very difficult situations. So whatever we can do to help on that front. And then our last category is advance. So a lot of churches want to see their neighbors. They want to see their communities. They want to see the gospel go out and go forth. They want to see the church expand into really difficult spots. Even all things considered, where they're already living at, there are places where there's, no churches, no gospel witness. And so when local churches tell us, hey, we have, we feel like the Lord's leading us to start a church plant, or we want to send one of our own missionaries to this location, this part of the country, we try and help when we can in those situations too. And then on the U.S. side, we just try and connect the body of Christ here to the brothers and sisters in those situations. So we want to help them be aware. We want to help them know what's going on around the world among their Christian family. We want to give them ideas about how they can pray and support and encourage that way. And then, sometimes people want to give. And if they want to give, we tell them how and where they can give to. So.
Awesome, thank you. Out of curiosity, have you always done this kind of work? Did you grow up near missionaries and stuff, or?
So from about college age onward, that's really where the heart for missions and a deeper understanding of what even that meant and what that could look like for a young man who wanted to use his life, however, to glorify God. So I went to a school, a university that was very involved in missions and taught it quite a bit. And so that's where the interest started. And then after college, I went and served as a missionary in Indonesia for for a number of years, and then came back and was involved in the United States with still very international context with refugees coming from different parts of the world to California, and then have been involved on and off in persecution type ministry international for 10 or so years since then. So
Okay.
yeah, kind of always been
Yeah.
had a foot in it some
Okay.
level. Yeah.
All right.
Joe, I'm curious if you could just give us maybe like an example of a type of project that ICR would be involved in.
Yeah, so like in India, for example, there's a lot of cases where we have helped with legal aid for pastors. And I know you know this as well, but so many times there's trumped up legal charges against pastors as a way to remove them from the pulpit or from a church and cause chaos or disruption in churches in India. And so we work with a few different organizations in country that help provide legal counsel and legal representation. Another example would be like Manipur, India, with all the persecution that's taken place in that region for Christians. There's like 60,000 Christians displaced. Houses burned, churches burned, and they're living out in the forest. So we're getting them food, Bibles, trying to find blankets, temporary shelter, things like that. So those are a few examples. There's other partnerships in places like Nigeria where, so many believers in the north have lost a family member or most of their family to Christian persecution and violence against Christians. So we have some projects there that take care of orphans, kids that have lost one or both of their parents to Christian persecution. And so we work with a partner there that provides a good Christian education for those kids, and it's going to see them all the way through 12th grade, or even some of them go on to college. We also help some widows with food and rent that have recently lost their husband, many of them pastors or church leaders. So things like that.
And just maybe another question, and I know it's not a competition among ministries. There's a lot of persecution ministries. Maybe not a lot, but there are several out there. Maybe what is unique about ICR? What's different about ICR than some of the other ministries that may be kind of in the same vein?
Yeah, well, we're certainly not the only ministry that's in that space, and I thank God for that. It takes a lot of us to do the work and show support and unity in the body of Christ. I think one thing that's a little bit distinctive about ICR is kind of our commitment to put the most resources towards the field as possible. So we don't have a large budget for marketing or advertising or things like that. We intentionally choose to focus most of our efforts on getting those resources to the church in need. And that's not a judgment on other ministries that spend more money on those types of things. But year over year, about 90% of all the funds that are donated to ICR actually wind up in the hands of persecuted believers and churches in the field. So that's pretty unique and pretty different, and something that I found very compelling when I took the job to work with them. It was a highly motivating factor for me. Mm-hmm. The other thing is, it's very relational. The partners we work with in the field, we move pretty slow in partnership. Trust is earned and it's built over time. We don't start with really large projects with people that we have no relationship with. So we may start small, and then year over year as that trust builds, we can kind of increase the funds we can send to various partners. So it's very, very relational and not transactional. We try to avoid that at all costs. Like, hey, we've received this money and we've got to get rid of it. How do we divvy it up? And that's not really how we work at all. We really go to these pastors and ministry leaders in the field and ask them, what's God putting on your heart to do? Like, what are the most important things you and your congregation feel like you need to do? And then in the field, we say, hey, we're going to pray with you, and we're going to commit to supporting what we can. And then we go and try and raise funds, and whatever we can get, we send on to them. So that's a little bit different.
Yeah, and I will say, having worked in that space in parachurch and persecution ministry, I mean, that's remarkable that 90 cents of every dollar is going to the field. I mean, that's remarkable in any ministry, really, but in those difficult spaces you guys are working in, I think that's pretty phenomenal. That's quite an efficiency rating right there. So that's well done.
Yeah, there are certain days it's a challenge.
Yeah,
it puts a little more pressure on our team and the administrative. But it's well worth it, and I'm glad we have some markers or some accountability on that space. It also allows us to be very open with supporters and churches that give money, that we let people designate as much money as they want. Most organizations don't do that.
Yeah.
So we love to be able to provide that freedom for people. If they have a particular place that's on their heart, they can give toward that particular project or country. So that's a little unique too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of curious, and it seems like you probably kind of have a sense of this much more than I do. Is there parts of the world that you've, in the last decade or 2 decades, you've seen Christianity, the attitude towards it change, and maybe local church growth change in a place maybe that we don't even think about? And then maybe vice versa to that, are there places where we think probably they're solid or good to go, and maybe there's not a lot of active things there necessarily, or people reaching out for support or whatever? I'm just kind of curious, I don't know what the makeup looks like in some of these globally across the world. So I'm just curious.
Yeah, so I think we were talking earlier about Iran. Iran's always a great example, and it's a great case study, I think, for many reasons. But with the Shah in late 70s, you had an entire community, entire country really committed to a theocracy, an Islamic theocracy. And man, they were all in. They got rid of anything and everything that was not on board. And then over time, decades, that began to crumble. They saw religious leaders, imams, political leaders just categorically destroying the economy, the family, more suicides than ever before, more drug use than ever before, more corruption than they had ever seen before, right? This was all under Islamic theocracy. And so over time, God allows those things, but people began to wake up to the fact that if this is real Islam, it's bankrupt. It's completely devoid of anything that's good for our families or for our country. And so the gospel begins to take root in various places. And now, of course, almost everyone says inside Iran is the fastest growing church in the world. And it's mysterious, right? Well, what does that look like? And how many believers are there actually? And, I hesitate to give numbers, but I would say I know that it's pretty radical, the amount of people that are coming to Christ. Even more significant, or maybe of interest to listeners, is to know that, I would be pretty confident saying probably more than than 50% of the population inside Iran are not committed Muslims any longer. Some just go agnostic, like, yeah, we know there's a God. We still kind of believe that, but it's not the God of Islam. We don't know who that God is, but we still believe in God. We just don't follow Islam anymore. And then others go atheist route. You know, there is no God. If there was, our lives wouldn't be this way. Usually that's actually step one before many of these Persians or Iranians are coming to Christ. Usually they've went that route, and then somehow they've heard the gospel and come to Christ. So you've got lots of house churches meeting in secret. You've still got heavy persecution. You've got Revolutionary Guard that are, their sole job is to locate Christians, locate these cells or house churches, and blow them up. And they, you know, arrest people, they arrest church leaders, they threaten, you know, I mean, it's full-blown persecution, and the threat is real for believers that live in those places. But the growth, the Christian growth, is also very real in countries like Iran. So, yeah, there's lots to say there. There's lots of challenges that churches face in Iran. Anytime you have something that's that underground, you know, you have the very real threat of false teaching. There's a massive, you know, need for good doctrine, good theology, good biblical teachers. A lot of people are learning about this Christian faith through media, whether that's websites or satellite TV. And, you know, I mean, you guys know how it is, even in America, right? You can get the whole gamut of theology from one extreme to another. So depending on who they're connected to, they may be getting fed something that's not great. So another spot would be, you know, we talked about ISIS, when ISIS came to power, kind of their rule and reign in the Levant, you know, years ago. A lot of Christian pastors from Iraq or Syria or Jordan have talked about, you know, ISIS was the best thing that ever happened for Christianity. And that seems unorthodox to say that, or like, how does that make sense, right? Because it was so evil and wicked. But that's precisely the reason they say that, because when nominal Muslims that live in those countries saw how ISIS operated, and then they didn't only see how they operated with brutality and almost like a seared, completely seared conscience, but they also heard the preaching and the teaching of ISIS. And it's hard to deny that what ISIS was doing and how they were operating and the ideology that fueled that was really close to that of Muhammad, right? So they actually were the pure Islam, and that's how they saw themselves. They needed to purify those countries that had become weak or nominal and not as committed to the principles found in the Quran. And so, you know, you got all these people riding the fence, all these Muslims, and when they saw that, they thought, man, if this is Islam, I don't want any part of it.
In some ways, they saw themselves like the Jewish Essenes, you know, they were the Islamic Essenes, the pure, faithful community.
And it's one man's opinion, but I think they were right in that assumption. Yeah. I think they were much closer to what early Islamic ideology looked like. I mean, you watch how they conquered North Africa. I mean, that's how they did it, by the sword. You know, why did the Crusades happen? Well, that's a whole nother conversation, but it was in response to a lot of that movement and how they operated and how they gained territory and adherence. So I don't think they were wrong. It's ugly, it's messy, but it actually is good that the evil of that religion was exposed in that way.
So, of the 55 countries you support, what would you see as the most challenging country, and what makes it challenging?
It's a good question. I think personally, Nigeria is hard to wrap my head around and understand how brutal the violence is, how open. It's one thing to see, like, we talk about different types of persecution. There's smash persecution, which is what Nigeria is facing. I don't care who sees it. I don't care who knows about it. We are going to smash Christians into the dirt. That's what's happening. But most of the time, in most countries, persecution is more nuanced. It's governments or entities or families. They try and cover some of that. They don't want it as open, as public. We call that squeeze. Or, they use your family members, or they use your job or your finances or jail or whatever to try and divert you or discourage you from following the Christian faith. But in places like Nigeria, where these radical fundamentalist Islamic groups just can come into a village and shoot everyone, and there's no consequence, there's no real deterrent for them. Like, what would stop them from doing that again? The government doesn't provide any kind of protection for those believers. It's been happening for 30 plus years. That situation's hard for me. And just the sheer number of Christians that are killed every year there it's hard for me to understand why the Lord has allowed that, for that period of time. And, we always want to solve things like, well, what's the solution? And it's like, I don't know what the solution is. I know we can encourage and try and pick up the pieces and support as best we can. But in the bigger scale of things going on in northern Nigeria, it's just, I don't know what the answer is. I'm sure we will at some point, and we'll be able to look back like we often do, kind of hindsight's 2020, and say, oh, that's what God was doing, but in the here and now, it's a difficult one to assess and even to respond to, really.
Yeah, in the beginning of the podcast, we talked about the martyr Polycarp and how he played the man, right? And in this ministry, there's a lot of courage that has to be summed up with the Holy Spirit, in this. And do you have any stories or observations you'd like to share about either things you personally witnessed and experienced that took some courage, or some stories you've gleaned and learned from folks you've worked with?
Yeah, there's quite a few, but I'll share one. I met a young man, probably 29 or 30 years old, in Turkey, and this has been years ago, maybe 5-6 years ago. And I knew who he was. He was living in Iran and had come out to Turkey to meet me and some others. And his father was Pastor Sudman from Iran. And I knew a little bit about his story, but no one can tell that story like his own son, right? And so I learned a lot of details from my time with him. But Haikov Sepian was an Armenian Christian that lived in Iran, had lived there his whole life. And you guys, not to go into all the details, but the Armenians had their own bouts with persecution, right, from Turkey, and how they were run out of there, and they landed in Syria and Iran and Iraq, Lebanon. So Haik Hovsepian was an Armenian Christian. And Iran at that point, if you were Assyrian or Armenian Christian, they kind of let you have your church as long as you just kept to yourself and didn't try and evangelize Persians or, the Muslim population there. They just kind of let you stay to yourself. Well, Haik was overseeing all the Assembly of God churches in Iran, and he had ordained Pastor Sudman. Pastor Sudman was from a Muslim background and had converted. And so what it took for Pastor Haik to ordain this Muslim convert, you can imagine the fear from the Armenian community. They're like, what are you doing? Don't you remember what these people did to us? And now you want to ordain one of them? You don't even know what this could mean. And what kind of pressure is this going to put on us from the government? They've told us you can't evangelize Persians. You can't graft them into your churches. And now you're publicly ordaining this man. So Pastor Sudman, ordained by Haik Hovsepian, goes back to his village, starts a house church. The house church is 6, 7, 8 people at most. Grows later, after a year or so, to 15. Well, then the government and the police catch wind of what's going on. And I can't tell the full story, but a long story short, I'll try and sum it up with this. Pastor Sudman is killed by the police. They don't tell the family where the body is. They never discover it. After he's killed, Pastor Haik Hovsepian goes to that city where he was killed and comforts the family, comforts the small little house church that's there, and tells them, we're with you. You're not alone. We're going to stay with you. Well, after that happened, everyone told Haik Hovsepian to get out of the country. He had connections in the West. He knew a lot of people. He could have left Iran, and everyone really encouraged him to leave. And he said, how can I leave the country when our pastors are being killed for their faith? What kind of example would that be to them? And so he stayed. And later, he himself was killed. But after that, another guy that Haik had worked with, named Mehdi Dabaj, was killed like 6 months later after Haik. So there was this series of several murders of Christians, of pastors in Iran back in the 80s and 90s. And then you see what you see today, this explosion. So I'm meeting with his son in Turkey, and I said, that village that you and your father, were from, what does the church look like now? And it was really cool and kind of emotional. He started crying, and he said, there's not one city block in that entire city now, and it's a city of 40,000, 50,000 people. There's not one city block where there's not a believer in that city today. So you think about that, what the Lord has done, and it's over the course of 30 years or whatever, but that's got to be pretty cool as a son to say, God used my dad and his willingness to stay and start a church in this city.
His dad was Sudman.
Yeah, Sudman. Yeah. So, that's always something that's very, very encouraging to me to see men that they knew what was coming. And if they didn't know exactly what was coming, they knew it was a high likelihood that might happen. Yeah. And they chose to stay anyways. And they knew that decision was going to be a very important witness for their congregations and for people. Because, either everyone leaves or we all stay. And so very, very powerful, and the church and many Muslim converts in Iran today are now learning about those stories And so, you know, we've got a friend here at church that talks about the heroes we celebrate. It's important to have these stories, and you know, of course, it's only because of God's grace. But in that vein, you know, these are Christian heroes, and they give us a witness, and they give us a model to follow, and it's important for us to know their stories.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that.
And it seems like when one person plays the man, it really does embolden others to play the man. You know, right? And then you just see this, you see the effects, the ripple effects of Summa Hakusepian. You know, it's really incredible to think about today. Joe, how could like if people want to connect with International Christian Response to get prayer updates, to potentially support you guys, like where can they find you? How can they connect with you?
So website is christianresponse.org. We've got a Facebook and an Instagram, ICR USA. But that's the best place to find us.
Great.
And all that information, if you want to get on a monthly newsletter list, or we also send out a prayer calendar. That's a pretty good tool if you just want to sit with your family, you know, before a meal or something like that, and just kind of pick out one or two of those prayer requests and pray for them as a family. That's another good small step all of us could take. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Joe. We appreciate it.
Yeah.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Play the Man podcast. Stay sturdy, friends.